Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here from Zoobox, and today we're going to be talking about 1984's Firestarter, or Stephen King's Firestarter if you want to get super specific and fancy. The film is directed by Mark L. Lester, written by Stanley Mann, adapted from a novel by Stephen King of the same name. It stars David Keith, Drew Barrymore, Freddie Jones, Heather Locklear, Martin Sheen, George C. Scott, Art Carney, Louise Fletcher, Moses Gunn, and others. And the synopsis is as follows. A couple who participated in a potent medical experiment gain telekinetic ability and then have a child who is pyrokinetic. It had been a very long time since I'd seen Firestarter. It's almost so long ago that this kind of felt like a first watch. I mean, I kind of knew the story, and definitely remembered more of it than I expected to, but I didn't have kind of the totality of the story and all the things that happened in my mind. So it felt like a fresh watch. And coming away from it, I really enjoyed it. You know, I'm not going to say it's kind of the best thing I've ever seen, or you need to run out and go watch Firestarter today. But it is a kind of an enjoyable science fiction horror thriller that deals with conspiracy and deals with, secretive government agencies and human experimentation, and it kind of has a kind of an air of kind of the psychological experiments that were going on with the CIA and whatnot in the 50s and 60s, and it's just kind of about a story about people dealing with that, a family specifically dealing with that. Through the experiments, these two adults, a man and a woman, David Keith and Heather Locklear, they get injected with some kind of serum. They develop psychic powers, basically, and then they have a kid who is even more powerful and has even more access to kind of being able to manipulate her environment in interesting ways, mostly to do with like raising temperatures and controlling atoms and how they move. And if you've ever been in a science class and you've ever watched or learned how water boils, what's happening to the atoms, she kind of has control over that kind of stuff. So she's kind of a hot ticket item in terms of, as far as the government is concerned, and they want to harness her power for kind of military use. She's like a walking nuke, kind of. She could do that. She could just level whole areas and kill people and set people on fire and all sorts of crazy stuff. You get like little previews of her powers kind of evolving. It has to do with her pituitary gland and what happens at puberty and how that's going to even unlock things that are even more crazy. It's got a little bit of a workman-like kind of vibe to it in terms of the director, Mark L. Lester, who did a lot of interesting stuff. He did Commando. He did Class of 1984, which is another kind of like science fiction movie. He did Showdown in Little Tokyo, Armed and Dangerous. He's got a filmography that's kind of a little bit all over the place in terms of like the types of movies he would make. And if I did have a major criticism for the movie, is that it does feel like almost like a little bit like a TV movie. And honestly, it might have been better as like a miniseries, because there's a lot of stuff to get into, and the movie does take its time. It's kind of got a deliberate pace to it. It's not the most like thrilling minute to minute watch, because it does take the time to kind of get into the characters and the motivations of the characters and the context of the world that they live in and what's going on with the government and how these people are kind of fighting against that. And so it's got a lot of interesting layers, and I appreciated that it took the time to, in some ways, investigate that and investigate the internal lives of the characters and how they feel about what's been done to them. But it leads it to feel a little underwhelming at times. And I think with a stronger director, with somebody who had a stronger vision or direction, I think it would have benefited a lot from that, because it does have all the pieces. It's got some great performances. George C. Scott, one of my all-time favorite actors, gives a interesting performance as John Rainbird, who's kind of this creepy government operative that's wants to get Drew Barrymore for reasons that are kind of unclear. They kind of make intimations that he's like maybe a pedophile and he wants to kind of possess the power of a god. If that stuff is not super clear, it's not super well developed in the story. And I wish it was. I wish we had gone a little bit farther into his character, John Rainbird's character, and who he was. Because it is a little bit of a mystery. And it's a mystery that feels like it's going to be resolved at some point, but it never really does. And I think the movie kind of suffers in the third act because of that. Because as everything comes together, it kind of becomes a little bit of just a straightforward action movie. It's just a series of big set pieces that happen, or big set pieces, relatively big set pieces to the rest of the movie. Because, part of it's the escalation of Drew Barrymore's, what's her name? Charlie's character, her escalation of power, and the kind of things that she can do when she's really like kind of put in a fight or flight situation. So there's some stuff that's interesting there with that stuff. And like I said, it does go into the kind of the internal lives of the characters, and there's a lot of talk about the kind of moral dilemma of using these powers and whether you should or you shouldn't. And there is, David Keith plays Drew Barrymore's father, and he's kind of, in a weird way, he's very desperate. They're on the run. His wife has been killed, or it's kind of even implied a little bit that maybe Charlie accidentally killed her mother, because she doesn't have control over her powers. So whenever she uses them, you don't really know how far she's going to take it, or if she's going to actually be able to control it. And her father is always kind of encouraging her to engage with it to a certain extent, even irresponsibly. And that's kind of what there is something there. I don't think they didn't get into that stuff maybe enough. I wish that the moral questions were a little bit more clear, and that they had done some more investigating of that stuff with the characters, because it is the best part of the movie. Is kind of the character journey and about humanity and its kind of evolution and what that means for other people that are not as evolved, and what happens when the state, who has the monopoly on violence, wants to kind of control you, which has got kind of an interesting parallel to this idea of like kind of the government and revolutionaries. If you were kind of to extract the idea of revolutionaries and extrapolate that to these characters, because they're higher evolved, they have more ability, but they're also kind of fighting against the system, and they are looking for a better life. They're looking for a paradigm shift in kind of a broad sense. And then there's the government, who wants to kind of maintain the status quo, wants to maintain its control over people and maintain control of all the powers, no matter how it kind of manifests. It's got a little bit of X-Men in there. Another movie it actually reminded me quite a bit of, and I think this other movie is much better, is David Cronenberg's Scanners. It's got a lot of similarities in terms of, corporate interests and government control with psychic people and whatnot. That's kind of the surface level of it, but it reminded me a lot of that. But I think like Scanners is more adult. It has a more interest in going into the subtext, whereas Firestarter feels a lot more kind of like populist, mainstream version of that kind of a story. And I've never read the source material novel, so I've never read Firestarter, so I don't know if it's deeper in the book. I assume it kind of is. I know in like the King universe, the organization or whatever it's called the Shop. I know that shows up, and I think even maybe a few years ago, he actually wrote kind of a sequel novel to this about the Shop and about a different cast of characters, I believe. So it's always been something King has been kind of, futzing around with in his writing. This concept, this agency, this kind of shadow conspiracy stuff, can run in the background of a lot of his stories. So I don't know how much deeper it gets into it with the novel. I tend to think that it's probably not. Stephen King is a populist writer. That's just kind of his perspective. He doesn't, even though I like a lot of his books and I've enjoyed them over the years, he's not the most intellectually deep writer. He's not writing philosophy. He's writing kind of straightforward, mainstream, easy to consume pop media. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I don't think there's anything. That's not a slag on Stephen King, because he does it really well. I mean, Stephen King's characters are always incredible. I agree with the most people's criticism that sometimes he has a hard time sticking the landing, but his characters are always great, and they're always what kind of pull you through the book. He does a great job of etching like really interesting and well-defined people. He's one of these writers that not every character sounds like a stand-in for Stephen King. But I don't think, I guess that's my long tangential way of saying that I don't think that the book probably did it much better in terms of that stuff. But like I said, I haven't read it, so I could be totally wrong. What else about Firestarter? What else? It's totally worth checking out. And if you got a local Walmart, I know I'm not a big Walmart shopper myself, but you get these Scream Factory things, these Shout Factory things for a reasonable price, I will go to Walmart. I'll do that, okay? Because I'm a fucking gross, filthy consumer and movie collector. I gotta have it. It's for posterity. There's some interesting stuff on here on the there's an audio commentary. There's kind of like a talking head making of that was actually pretty interesting, pretty thorough. It was like an hour long. A little bit of fun trivia about the movie. John Carpenter was originally slated to direct Firestarter. He had made another movie with Universal previous. One of his masterpiece, in my opinion, is The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing, but it bombed at the time. It did not do well the year it came out. And it was critically derided, and he got completely raked over the coals, and they beat the shit out of that movie. And as a consequence, Universal didn't want to work with him, or they were squirrely about working with him and giving him a budget of this size. And so they passed on Carpenter and gave it to Lester. Mark L. Lester. I would have loved to have seen John Carpenter at that point in his career do this. It's interesting. The movie he ends up doing after The Thing is another Stephen King story, though. It's Christine in 1983. It came out the year before this. And Christine is, if you've never seen it, is a really, really underrated movie in Carpenter's canon, in his filmography. It's not one a lot of people talk about, but it is actually really, really good. It's really well executed. So with having seen Christine, and that came out, like I said, a year before this, it would have been interesting to see what Carpenter would have brought to this material at that point in his career. I think you would have had a movie that had a little bit of a darker edge, and that was maybe a little less mainstream friendly, because you watch his movies, you watch things like Escape from New York, The Thing, Assault on Precinct 13. He had this an edge to him, this unique voice. And it would have been cool to see what he would have done with like kind of government conspiracies and people with psychic abilities and whatnot. Would have been interesting. But we never got that, unfortunately. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to know more about Zoobox, there's a bunch of links in the description for Facebook, for our Instagram, and for my personal Twitter. If you'd like to make a recommendation for these daily videos or for a future episode of Zoobox Goes to the Movies, leave a comment, and I will put it on the list. All right, everybody. Have a good one.